What if I told you that the most powerful ruler in Russian history wasn't a czar, nor a man, but a foreign-born woman who seized a throne with no rightful claim and ruled an empire with ink, seduction, and steel? She was never meant to be remembered. But history couldn't forget her, and neither will you. This is Whisper from History, where the dead do not sleep, and the past still breathes. Tonight we uncover the life of Catherine the Great, a woman who rewrote her destiny and forced a nation to kneel. Dim the lights, turn down the world, and listen closely. Because history rarely shouts, it whispers. She was born in the brittle light of a May morning, 1729. Not in grandeur, not in power, but in the dim, quiet corridors of a lesser German principality. Her name at the time was Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst. It was long, awkward, and easily forgotten outside the small courts of the Holy Roman Empire. No poets sang of her birth. No statesman took note of her name. Her world was built of frost-bitten cobblestones, stiff etiquette, and the stifled ambition of a family teetering on the lower edge of nobility. But destiny, it doesn't knock. It whispers. Sophie's father was a Prussian officer, disciplined, distant, loyal to crown and uniform. Her mother, a very different creature. Johanna Elizabeth was sharp-tongued, relentlessly ambitious, and profoundly dissatisfied with the family's modest station. She wanted more. She expected more. And from the moment her daughter could walk without falling, she was grooming her for something larger, something better. Marriage, of course, but not just any match. A clever match. A useful one. A throne, maybe, if luck played its hand right. Sophie felt this pressure long before she could name it. It hung in the air like smoke. Every correction, every cold glance from her mother was laced with that unspoken expectation. You must rise. And she did, but not by accident. She was not beautiful in the traditional sense, not ethereal, not delicate. But her eyes were arresting, sharp, calculating, hungry. She learned quickly, with an almost eerie intensity. Languages, literature, politics, she devoured it all. Where other girls giggled and danced, Sophie watched. Studied. Waited. The walls of Zerbst were narrow, but her mind reached out through them like fingers pressed to cold glass. She was not content to be decorative. She was not born to be still. And then the letter came. Russia. Cold, vast, distant. And on the throne, a woman who had clawed her way there with cunning and ruthlessness. Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. She had no heir of her own, only a nephew, Peter of Holstein-Gottorp. A strange boy, sickly, awkward, isolated, but legitimate. And he needed a bride. Not a powerful one, not a dangerous one, but a pliable one, a German one. Johanna saw it immediately. This was the opening. And Sophie? She didn't flinch. She packed her dreams in silence and left behind the stony halls of her childhood. She was only 14. The journey across Europe was long and cold, but what lay ahead would be colder still. Russia was not welcoming. It did not bend. It tested, always. Sophie arrived in the Russian court with wide eyes and a racing heart, wrapped in unfamiliar furs, her breath catching in the frigid air like smoke. She bowed, smiled, listened, learned. Everything about her had to change. Her clothes, her language, her religion. They made her orthodox, gave her a new name, a Russian name, Catherine, and with it, a new identity. She accepted it without hesitation, without tears, because she knew this was the price. To be remembered, she first had to disappear. Her fiancé, Peter, was a disappointment almost immediately. Childish, petulant, obsessed with toy soldiers and German war games. He spoke no Russian, showed no affection, and laughed at the things she held dear. He had no interest in ruling, no interest in her. But Catherine was watching, waiting. The Russian court was a battlefield dressed in lace. Intrigue hid behind every fan, every polite phrase. Empress Elizabeth ruled like a goddess wrapped in silk, unpredictable, powerful, vain. Catherine learned her moods, studied her courtiers, and slowly, without ever announcing her intentions, began building something no one could yet see: influence. She read the forbidden philosophers of the West in secret: Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot. Their words whispered of freedom, of reason, of a world ruled not by birth but by brilliance. She didn't just read them, she believed them. Even as she moved through a court that believed in bloodlines and divine right, her mind was already imagining something different, something better. Peter, meanwhile, grew more unstable. He idolized Frederick of Prussia, Russia's enemy. He played at war while Catherine played at survival. They slept in separate rooms. They shared no secrets, only silence. And then, in 1761, Elizabeth died. Peter ascended the throne. Peter III. It should have been Catherine's moment to rise beside him. Instead, it became the moment everything snapped. He alienated the army, offended the clergy, humiliated the nobility. Within months he was hated, truly, dangerously hated. And Catherine? She was ready. There are turning points in every life, moments that define everything that follows. For Catherine, it came in the breathless early hours of a July morning in 1762. They came for her quietly, the guards, the officers, the whispered vows of loyalty. She rode to the barracks in full uniform, sword at her side, her eyes blazing with clarity. She spoke not as a wife, not as a widow, but as an empress. They declared her Catherine II, autocrat of all the Russias. Peter was arrested. Days later, he was dead. They said it was natural causes, but no one truly believed it. And Catherine never explained. She didn't need to. The girl from Zerbst, the girl no one expected, now wore the crown of Peter the Great, alone, unchallenged. But this was no fairy tale. The throne was cold, the court colder. Russia was vast, ungovernable, roiling with unrest and hunger. And Catherine, she would rule it with both elegance and iron. For 34 years. She would outwit rebellions, survive betrayals, seduce allies, and crush enemies. She would rewrite laws, expand borders, and reimagine what a monarch could be. She would invite the Enlightenment into the winter palaces of Russia, even as she used its ideals to sharpen her own power. She would love often, strategically, passionately, but never blindly. And history, it would never look at her the same again. But power has its price, and Catherine's reign, for all its brilliance, cast long shadows. Before the light, there is always the dark, and to understand Catherine the Great, truly understand her, you must walk through both. With her, step by step, into the palace, into the secrets, into the blood. This is not just the story of an empress. It is the story of how a girl became an empire.
She stood beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Winter Palace, surrounded by gold, mirrors, and silence. It was July of 1762. Outside, the city of St. Petersburg buzzed with rumors, whispers of a coup, a death, a coronation. But inside the palace, Catherine was calm, still, watching. She knew that thrones were not given. They were taken. And now that she had Russia beneath her feet, she would not allow it to slip from her grasp. Peter was gone. Her husband, the Tsar for barely 6 months, had been forced to abdicate without a drop of royal blood spilled in public. But then, somewhere in the quiet countryside where he was held, a body appeared. Bruised. Lifeless. No investigation. No trial. Just a carefully worded announcement. Natural causes. Catherine's hands, officially, were clean. Unofficially, she had become the most powerful woman in Europe. But at what cost? Did she grieve? Did she feel guilt? She never said. She never had to. Her silence was a language of its own. Russia, though, was not so easily quieted. She was a German, a woman, an usurper. And the nobility, the boyars, watched her with veiled contempt. They had helped her seize power, yes, but loyalty born from ambition is fragile. temporary. Catherine understood this better than any of them. So she moved swiftly. The army was paid. The church was flattered. The Senate, a bloated ceremonial body, was summoned and praised as the wise council of the realm. She gave everyone just enough illusion of power to keep them from asking for more. But she kept the reins in her own hands. Still, the first months of her reign were perilous. Every corridor echoed with threats. Every courtier smiled too easily. Her crown, though placed upon her head by force, had not yet settled. It could still be taken, dislodged, cracked. She didn't sleep, not deeply, not for years. Instead, she wrote letters, decrees, reforms. She buried herself in philosophy and law. Voltaire had once been a distant voice in her reading chamber. Now he was her pen pal. They corresponded like old friends, both entranced by the idea of enlightened monarchy, a sovereign not by birth but by reason, by intellect. She wanted to bring Europe to Russia, its art, its science, its progress. But Russia was not Europe. It was colder, harsher, older, ruled less by reason and more by rhythm, of seasons, of peasant toil, of the Orthodox Church. Enlightenment? To the average Russian, it meant little. What they understood was bread, land, protection. And Catherine, despite her lofty ideals, knew this. She could not govern a fantasy. She had to govern Russia. So, she became Russian in every way that mattered. She spoke the language fluently. She embraced Orthodox rituals, celebrated Russian saints, quoted Russian poets. She dressed in traditional robes for ceremonies, stood in freezing cathedrals until her knees ached, and toasted the ancestors of Muscovy. But behind her eyes, there was always that German spark, that hunger. Her first major challenge came not from the palace, but from the south. A man named Yemelyan Pugachev, a Cossack, a deserter, a liar. He claimed to be Peter III, her dead husband, returned from the grave to reclaim his throne. It was madness, but the people believed him, not because they loved Peter, but because they hated Catherine's nobles. The serfs, bound to the land like cattle, lived lives of brutality, beaten, taxed, ignored. Pugachev offered something simpler: freedom. His rebellion spread like fire. Peasants rose in the Volga region, forts were taken, nobles were butchered, their homes burned. Entire towns were swallowed by violence. Pugachev declared a new court, a new order. His men called him Tsar. For the first time, Catherine's grip faltered. She responded not with mercy, but with steel. Troops were sent, villages punished, the rebellion crushed. Pugachev was captured, paraded through Moscow in a cage. He begged for mercy. He received none. He was executed in public, beheaded, quartered, his remains displayed. A warning. Catherine watched. She didn't flinch. The rebellion had lasted nearly 2 years. Its scars were deep, and Catherine had learned something vital. Russia was a beast. It needed order, control, not dreams of liberty. After that, she doubled down. She gave the nobility more power over the serfs, a terrible bargain, but a necessary one to secure her throne. In exchange, they gave her loyalty, or at least silence. It was the Enlightenment, rewritten for survival. She rewrote the law, codified justice, reformed education, opened schools for girls, built libraries, supported vaccination campaigns. She even convened a legislative commission in 1767, inviting representatives from across the empire to advise on reforms. It was ambitious, hopeful, but it collapsed under its own weight. Too many voices, too many contradictions. And in the end, too dangerous. She dissolved it quietly. Another dream, buried under snow. And yet, her vision never faltered. Russia expanded under her gaze. She pushed the borders west into Poland, dividing the country like meat at a royal banquet. 3 partitions, 3 careful bites. By 1795, Poland was gone from the map. She looked south. to the Black Sea. The Ottomans stood in her way. They fell. Crimea was annexed. New cities were built: Odessa, Sevastopol. She called them jewels of the South. Russia called her the Great. But titles don't come without shadows. Every triumph came at a cost. Every reform was soaked in contradiction. The serfs suffered more than ever. The nobility grew richer, lazier, more cruel. The Enlightenment became a crown, worn over shackles. And still, Catherine smiled, wrote letters, hosted salons, charmed ambassadors. She was always in motion, always listening. And sometimes she loved, not once, not twice, but many times. Her lovers were not secret. They were strategy, allies, confidants. Some were young officers with beauty and ambition. Others, seasoned statesmen. All chosen carefully, rewarded lavishly, and discarded when necessary. She gave them titles, land, power, but never her throne, never her rule, because Catherine, above all, understood that in a world where women were meant to obey, she had become the exception, not by kindness, but by calculation. She was not soft. She could not afford to be. Even as her portraits showed a gentle smile, her mind was 3 steps ahead, navigating politics, managing spies, drafting legislation, reading Plato by candlelight while snow fell softly outside her palace windows. And so, the girl from Zerbst became a legend. But legends are not always loved. They are remembered, and the story of Catherine the Great is only just beginning.
The palace was never silent. Even in the deepest hour of night, when the torches along the Neva flickered and the halls emptied of servants, there was always the sound of footsteps echoing through the corridors, the shuffle of guards, the low murmur of officials pacing behind closed doors. Catherine didn't sleep easily, not anymore. Power had a price, and for her, it was rest. She would lie awake, cloaked in velvet and fur, the candle on her desk burning low as she pored over letters, state reports, and foreign newspapers smuggled in through diplomatic pouches. To rule Russia was to dance with shadows, to know what was being whispered in Warsaw, plotted in Vienna, or promised in Paris before the ink had even dried. And across Europe, they were whispering about her. A woman on the throne, a foreigner, an Enlightenment empress who read French philosophers but ruled a land frozen in feudalism. She was a contradiction too large to ignore. And they watched her, kings, ministers, ambassadors, all waiting for the moment she would falter. But she didn't. In fact, Catherine seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. She surrounded herself with some of the sharpest minds of the age. Her court became a center of correspondence, debate, diplomacy, and, of course, spectacle. Balls, operas, and masquerades filled the calendar. But these weren't just diversions. They were tools. Each waltz was a conversation, each costume a message. Her salons were glittering webs of power, and Catherine sat at the center, smiling, listening, remembering. Among the many who circled her orbit, one figure stood out in these years: Grigory Potemkin. He was not her first lover. He would not be her last. But he was something different. Brilliant, brash, charismatic. Potemkin had fought in her name during the coup, and in the years since, he had become far more than just a favorite. To Catherine, he was an equal, a partner. Some say they married in secret. Others insist it was merely love, deep, wild, and impossible to tame. Whatever the truth, their connection reshaped the empire. Potemkin was a visionary. He dreamed in grand, impossible scale. Under his influence, Catherine's expansionist ambitions crystallized. They looked south together, to the Black Sea, to Crimea, to the warm waters that had eluded Russian rulers for centuries. The Ottomans still held sway in the region, but the empire was aging, fraying at the edges. Potemkin saw an opportunity, and Catherine, ever pragmatic, gave him her blessing and her armies. The wars against the Ottoman Empire were brutal, bloody, fought across vast steppes and along jagged coastlines. But they were also successful. In 1783, Russia formally annexed Crimea, a triumph centuries in the making. Catherine called it a liberation, The West called it a provocation. Potemkin called it destiny. To showcase their victory, he organized one of the most infamous spectacles of the era, the so-called Potemkin villages. Grand facades built along the banks of the Dnieper River, designed to impress the Empress as she toured her new territories. Beautiful, glittering towns with painted windows. Actors posed as cheerful peasants. Livestock carefully staged to appear plentiful. Was it all a lie, or a masterstroke of propaganda? Perhaps both. Catherine understood the performance. She was never naive. But the image, the illusion, mattered. She wasn't just building an empire. She was crafting a myth. And myths need theater. But while Catherine wove her legend in the south, storm clouds gathered in the west. Poland. For centuries, Poland had been a proud, sprawling commonwealth, its nobles fiercely protective of their rights, its king elected rather than born. But by the late 18th century, it was a state weakened by infighting, surrounded by wolves. Catherine moved first. In 1764, she installed a lover, Stanisław August Poniatowski, as King of Poland. The Polish nobles protested, the people rioted, but Catherine stood firm. Through diplomacy, threats, and military presence, she kept her grip on the country's politics. Still, Poland refused to die quietly. In 1791, against all odds, the Polish Sejm passed a progressive constitution, the first of its kind in Europe. It limited noble privilege, strengthened the monarchy, and laid the foundation for a modern state. Catherine saw it for what it was, a threat. An independent, reformed Poland would unravel her influence and inspire rebellion elsewhere. So she struck back. In 1792, under the pretense of defending the old order, Russian troops invaded. It was the beginning of the end. The second partition followed. Poland carved up between Russia and Prussia. Cities, forests, rivers, all divided with cold precision. And when Poland dared to rise again in 1794, led by the idealistic Tadeusz Kościuszko, Catherine crushed the uprising with ruthless force. By 1795, Poland was gone, an entire nation erased. Catherine signed the final partition with her usual composure, but she had not emerged unscathed. The Polish wars were costly. They stirred unrest within her own borders, and abroad they painted her not as a philosopher queen, but as a conqueror cloaked in ideals. The Enlightenment was slipping. The world had changed. Across the Channel in France, a storm had broken loose, a revolution fueled by hunger, rage, and radical thought. The monarchy had fallen, the king and queen had lost their heads, and the old world, her world, trembled. Catherine had once admired the French thinkers. Now she feared their legacy. She banned their works, expelled sympathizers, reversed reforms she had once championed. The woman who had built her rule on the dream of reason now ruled with suspicion, tightening her grip. She wrote of liberty and expanded censorship. She praised justice and expanded serfdom. Her words still soared, but her deeds grew heavier, more imperial, and perhaps more desperate. Potemkin was gone now. He had died suddenly in 1791, likely of fever, in the dusty roads of the empire he helped build. Catherine mourned him deeply, quietly. She kept his portrait near her writing desk, surrounded by letters they had exchanged, faded, worn, still folded with care. Without him, she seemed lonelier, more guarded. The court grew colder, the palace quieter, but still she worked. Even in her 60s, she rose early, met with ministers, signed decrees, wrote memoirs. Her hand, increasingly unsteady, still moved with purpose. She was preparing for the future, grooming her grandson Alexander for rule, hoping perhaps that he might carry forward the better parts of her legacy. Because she knew time was catching up. The woman who had once walked into Russia as a girl with no crown, no allies, and no claim, now ruled an empire larger than any czar before her. But empires are not eternal, nor are the hands that hold them. She had built a legacy. But what would history remember? The Empress of Light or the autocrat in shadow? The answer was drawing near.
Autumn had come to St. Petersburg. The gardens of Tsarskoye Selo, once a riot of color, stood still and brittle beneath a gray sky. Leaves drifted in slow spirals to the earth, their deaths unnoticed by the palace windows behind which an empire pulsed with quiet unrest. Inside, Catherine sat alone at her desk. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her pen. The candles around her flickered with the dying light of day, and the paper before her remained nearly blank. She had been writing her memoirs, a life not of dreams, but of calculations, of conquest, of blood. But some memories refused to be tamed by ink. Outside, the court moved on without her. Whispers rose like smoke. She was aging, slower, her eyes less sharp, her temper more brittle. And though she remained on the throne, her ministers had begun looking elsewhere, toward her grandson, Alexander. Not her son. Paul had waited his entire life to rule. A life spent in her shadow, untrusted, unloved, and deliberately kept from power. Catherine saw in him a weakness, an instability, perhaps something darker. And so she planned to bypass him entirely, to name Alexander, young, intelligent, promising, as her heir. It was a dangerous plan, one she would never finish. On the morning of November 16th, 1796, Catherine rose early, as always. She walked through her chambers, gave instructions to her attendants, and took tea in silence. And then, without warning, she collapsed. A stroke, massive, irreversible. She was carried to her bed, unconscious. The physicians came, summoned in panic, but there was little they could do. The woman who had ruled Russia with such clarity, such relentless will, was now beyond their reach. By nightfall it was over. The Empress of all the Russias, Catherine II, Catherine the Great, was dead. Her body lay still in the Winter Palace, surrounded by guards in silence. But the silence did not last. Paul moved quickly. He seized the throne before dawn, tearing through her papers, burning the documents that named Alexander as heir. Her orders, her wishes, her legacy, undone in a single night. He reversed many of her policies, exiled her allies, banned her memoirs. Even the ceremonial aspects of her funeral were cold, joyless. A mother buried by a son who never forgave. And yet, the world noticed. In Paris, in London, in Vienna, the news spread like thunder. The Empress was gone. And with her, an era. But what had she left behind? Catherine's Russia was not the same land she had entered as a girl of 14. She had expanded its borders by hundreds of thousands of square miles. She had brought the Enlightenment to its icy heart. And then, with fire, she had burned it back. She had modernized the court, empowered education, and nurtured the arts. She had also empowered the nobility, crushed rebellion, and presided over the brutal expansion of serfdom. To some she was a philosopher queen, to others a tyrant in silk. History, that slow, unforgiving witness, would never quite decide. But those who lived under her rule never forgot her gaze, the way she studied people, measured them, the way she entered a room and owned it, the way she played the part of empress not as a performance, but as possession. And what of love? Of that there was much, and yet perhaps so little. Dozens of lovers, each raised to dizzying heights, then dismissed when they became too comfortable. Catherine did not need love. She used it, sometimes as currency, sometimes as camouflage. But Potemkin, he was different. And in her final days, his name appeared again in her letters, in the quiet margins of her notes, scrawled in a hand less steady than before. No empire could give her what he gave, a mirror, an equal, a dangerous, impossible thing for a woman who had been alone for so long. Now the empire mourned her, in its own way. The peasants whispered prayers. The nobles raised glasses. The army stood in rigid silence. But Russia itself, the land, the people, the ghost of its czars, seemed to pause, if only for a moment, as if it too recognized that something had shifted, something vast and irreplaceable. Catherine had ruled for 34 years, Longer than Peter the Great, longer than any woman before her. Her enemies had called her unnatural. Her lovers had called her magnificent. Her people, in time, would simply call her Velikaya, the Great. And what made her great? Was it the conquests, the laws, the glittering court? Or was it something colder, deeper, her refusal to accept the limits of birth, of gender, of fate? She had been born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess in a forgotten duchy. She died Catherine the Great, empress of the largest empire on earth, not by accident, not by kindness, but by force of will, the kind of will that bends the course of history, and leaves behind a silence that echoes for centuries. But in that silence, there is still one question left unanswered. Was she building an empire for Russia, or only for herself?
Winter had tightened its grip on St. Petersburg. The Neva lay frozen beneath a crust of ice so thick that sleighs passed over it without sound, their wheels muffled, their horses pluming steam into the brittle sky. Snow clung to the eaves of the Winter Palace like ash, and the city, imperial, magnificent, and mournful, seemed to hold its breath. Catherine was gone, but her ghost had not left. It drifted in the marble halls, behind every locked door, in the draughts that whispered along the gilded corridors. It lived in the fear and fury of her son, now Tsar Paul V, a man raised in bitterness and crowned in vengeance. Paul had waited too long. All his life, he had been the neglected heir, the whispered afterthought. Catherine had kept him from state affairs, kept him under watch, under suspicion, under her heel. Even his tutors had been selected not for brilliance, but for docility. His entire childhood had been an exercise in humiliation, and now he would make them all remember. Within days of taking the throne, Paul began undoing his mother's legacy. Her reforms, reversed, her favorites, exiled or disgraced, her laws, pulled apart piece by piece. Even her bones could not rest in peace. Paul had the remains of Peter III, the father he never knew, exhumed and buried with full imperial honors beside Catherine, as if to remind the world that she had ruled only through theft and sin. There was venom in every decree, madness in every glance. He dressed the court in Prussian uniforms. He forced the army to march in drills more suited to parade grounds than the battlefield. His paranoia deepened. Walls were thickened, guards doubled, doors locked from both sides. The nobility began to murmur, and the shadows began to stir. Paul had not inherited Catherine's instinct for danger. He had inherited her enemies. They gathered quietly, generals, ministers, noblemen, those who had once served under the Empress, who had watched her turn a fractured land into an empire of iron and silk. They did not mourn her out of love. They mourned the order she had kept, the balance she had mastered. And Paul was not balance. He was fire on dry grass. On the night of March 23, 1801, they came for him. It was late. The palace at St. Michael's was dark, save for a few candles still burning in the Tsar's study. Paul had grown increasingly isolated in recent weeks. He trusted few, spoke even less. His mind, some whispered, was unraveling. A group of officers, loyal to no one but themselves, forced their way inside. They found him in his bedroom, raging, screaming, pleading. What happened next remains clouded by silence and contradiction. Some say it was quick, a blow to the head. Others claim he was strangled with a sash, the very one Catherine had once draped across his shoulders as a child. Either way, Paul was dead by dawn, and in his place stood a boy who had watched it all with unblinking eyes. Alexander, the grandson Catherine had loved, prepared, and tried to protect from the poison of her own bloodline. Now he wore the crown, and in his hands he held the impossible inheritance of two rulers who could not have been more different. One, a philosopher queen who wrapped tyranny in silk and education. The other, a bitter tyrant who never learned to wear his crown without resentment. Alexander would have to choose. What kind of czar would he become? The court was quick to shape his image, young, enlightened, humane. He spoke in the language of reform. He reopened universities. He spoke of easing the burdens of the serfs. He surrounded himself with liberal-minded advisors, many of them once favored by his grandmother. For a time it seemed Russia might thaw, but beneath the optimism, beneath the gilded ceilings and polished speeches, Catherine's shadow remained. Her bureaucracy, her nobles, her empire of secrets. Nothing had truly changed. And in Europe, the world was on fire. A name now echoed across every royal court, every battlefield, every frightened dinner table in the old world. Napoleon. The French Revolution had devoured itself. In its ashes rose a man who declared himself emperor and began redrawing the map of Europe with cannon fire. Catherine had feared this future. Now Alexander would face it. He entered the war cautiously, reluctantly. But as Napoleon marched eastward, Russia found itself drawn deeper into the storm. At Austerlitz in 1805, Alexander tasted the bitter wine of defeat. The Russian army, brave but disorganized, was crushed alongside its Austrian allies. The loss haunted him. Not just the battle, but the humiliation. The feeling of standing before a new kind of emperor, one made not by bloodline, but by ambition. Napoleon was everything Catherine had admired, and everything she had feared. And Alexander was still unproven. In the years that followed, he played a dangerous game. Alliances shifted, treaties signed and broken. He dined with Napoleon, even embraced him, and then plotted behind his back. In 1812, the facade shattered. Napoleon invaded Russia. What followed was not a war, it was annihilation. Alexander refused to fight a single decisive battle. Instead, he let the land devour the enemy. The Russian army retreated, city by city, village by village, dragging Napoleon deeper into the wilderness. When the French reached Moscow, they found it abandoned, its homes empty, its streets silent. And then it burned. The fire raged for days, turning the city into a funeral pyre. Napoleon had won nothing. By winter's end, his army, once the greatest in Europe, lay buried in the snow. Alexander became the hero of the continent, the Tsar who had outlasted the monster, who had saved Christendom, who rode into Paris in 1814, not as a conqueror, but as a redeemer. But he knew the truth. It had not been glory, it had been sacrifice. The land had bled, the people had starved, whole towns had vanished. And when the cheering stopped, Alexander returned to a Russia that no longer felt like home. He had seen too much, he had lost too much, and as the years wore on, he began to change. He withdrew, grew suspicious, religious, haunted by visions of judgment, of apocalypse, of Catherine watching from some unreachable distance, always watching. By the 1820s, the boy she had once protected had become a ghost in his own palace. He avoided his ministers, trusted mystics, wandered through rooms filled with icons and candle smoke. And then, in 1825, in a far-off city called Taganrog, Alexander fell ill. The official cause was typhus, but the truth was more complex. Some say he faked his death, escaped, became a wandering monk. Others say he simply gave up, consumed by guilt, by grief, by the weight of an empire that had never once allowed him to rest. He was buried beside his father, Paul, but not beside Catherine. She still lay in St. Peter and Paul Cathedral, beneath a slab of white marble, her name etched in gold. Empress, autocrat, the Great. And as her grandson's coffin was lowered into the earth, those who watched could not help but wonder, had anything changed? Or was Russia still living in her shadow? Even now.
Snow whispered through the trees of the imperial estate, muffling the sounds of the world. A hush had settled over Russia. Not the peace of calm, but the silence that comes before collapse. The throne was empty again. With Alexander's death, a quiet crisis uncoiled itself across the empire. It wasn't spoken of openly. It rarely was in Russia. But behind closed doors, among courtiers and generals and clergymen, confusion bloomed like mold. Alexander had no children, and though his brother Constantine had been named heir in secret, he had quietly renounced the throne years earlier, content to govern Poland from afar. The news of that renunciation had never been made public. Many believed Constantine was Tsar, and for a few terrifying days, no one could say for certain who ruled Russia. Into this void stepped a third Romanov brother, Nicholas. You wouldn't have noticed him in a crowd. He lacked Alexander's elegance, lacked Paul's wild-eyed paranoia. But Nicholas possessed something his predecessors had not. Clarity. Cold, unwavering, unquestioning clarity. Where Catherine had seduced power and Alexander had agonized over it, Nicholas seized it. On December 26, 1825, as snow buried St. Petersburg in silent white drifts, a group of young officers gathered in Senate Square. They were noblemen, sons of generals, sons of Catherine's Enlightenment. They had traveled west, studied in Paris, seen how other peoples had thrown off their kings and rewritten the rules. They had read Voltaire, yes, but also Rousseau and Jefferson and the bloody poetry of revolution. They called themselves the Decembrists, and they believed it was time for Russia to change. They wanted a constitution, an end to autocracy, a state ruled by laws, not whims. That morning, they marched through the snow, thousands of soldiers behind them, their breath rising in the freezing air. They stood in the square, weapons in hand, demanding that Nicholas swear no oath to the throne. The people watched from the windows, and Nicholas watched from the shadows. He waited, measured, then acted. And then, as always, it endured. But something had shifted. No longer was it ruled by vision or terror alone. It was now ruled by fear, not of enemies abroad, but of the people within. By nightfall, Senate Square was soaked in blood and ice. Artillery fire had torn through the protesters. Screams echoed off the frozen riverbanks. The Decembrists, those that survived, were rounded up, interrogated, and exiled to Siberia. Some were hanged in silence. Others vanished into the frost. The rebellion had lasted less than a day, but it had given Nicholas something Catherine had always understood, a pretext. He would now rule with a purpose, to crush not just disobedience, but dissent. To root out not just rebellion, but the idea of rebellion. He transformed the imperial police into a vast machine of suspicion. Letters were read, words forbidden, eyes and ears multiplied in every town and tavern. He called it orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, a sacred trinity. But what he had built was a cage. Russia grew in his image, ordered, beautiful, hollowed out. Palaces gleamed under fresh coats of paint, but peasants starved in silence. Serfdom remained a stain across the land. Tens of millions bound to the soil, sold with it, dying in it. Catherine had flirted with emancipation. Alexander had dreamed of it. Nicholas ignored it entirely. Progress became treason. And still, the empire swelled. Nicholas expanded Russia's reach in the Caucasus, pushed deeper into Central Asia. His armies were vast, his bureaucracy relentless. He saw himself as the iron wall between Christian Europe and the chaos of the East. He sent soldiers into Hungary to crush rebellion. He dictated terms to Persia, to Turkey. He became feared. And then, as always in Russian history, came the war that changed everything. Crimea. It began as a conflict over holy sites in Jerusalem, a dispute between Orthodox and Catholic claims. But beneath the surface, it was a battle for dominance. Russia versus the Ottomans. Nicholas believed victory would be swift. He underestimated everything. Britain and France intervened. The Black Sea turned to smoke. Sevastopol became a tomb. Russian soldiers, poorly supplied and hopelessly outgunned, died in the mud and snow by the tens of thousands. The railroads Catherine had once imagined had never been built. The medicine she had imported had withered in bureaucratic neglect. The empire's rust was now visible for all to see, and as his armies fell, Nicholas withdrew into himself. The cold certainty that had defined his rule gave way to bitterness, then to sickness. In March of 1855, he died, not in battle, not in exile, but in his bed. Some whispered it was suicide. Others said his heart simply stopped. He was buried with the Romanov dead, not as a reformer, not as a builder, but as the last true autocrat. And in his place rose a son who had lived too long in his shadow, Alexander II. The boy Nicholas had molded with iron hands. The man who would become something his father could never be, a reformer. Or perhaps just another dreamer in a palace of ghosts. Alexander II saw the empire as it truly was, backward, broken, buckling under its own weight. He saw the Crimean failure not as an anomaly, but as a symptom. And so in 1861 he did the unthinkable. He freed the serfs, all of them, over 20 million souls, loosed from bondage with the stroke of a pen. The edict thundered across Russia like prophecy. It was the single largest emancipation in human history. But freedom came with chains of its own. The serfs were liberated, but not fed. Given land, but burdened with crushing debts. A peasant with a deed was still a peasant. And the nobility, wounded and vengeful, resisted every attempt at reform. The courts, the schools, the military, everything moved forward in slow, grinding agony. Still, Alexander pressed on. He modernized the army, built railways, opened universities. He envisioned a Russia that could stand beside the great powers, not behind them. For a time, it seemed he might succeed. But beneath the surface, the fire had already started. Radicals saw his reforms as too little, too late. Revolutionaries, once only whispers, now wrote openly, organized openly. They no longer dreamed of changing the empire. They dreamed of ending it. Assassins stalked the Tsar. Bombs were thrown. Trains derailed. In 1881, after countless failed attempts, they finally succeeded. On a cold day in March, as Alexander rode through the streets of St. Petersburg in a closed carriage, a man threw a bomb beneath the wheels. It missed. The Tsar stepped out, shaken, furious, and called to the crowd. A second man stepped forward. The second bomb exploded beneath his feet. When they reached him, the lower half of his body was gone. His last words were whispered to a priest, as blood soaked the snow. "I see." And then, nothing. Another Romanov gone. Another Tsar torn apart by the contradictions his family had created. Power and progress. Order and rebellion. Majesty and violence. The empire mourned. And then, as always, it endured. But something had shifted. No longer was it ruled by vision or terror alone. It was now ruled by fear, not of enemies abroad, but of the people within.
The Romanovs were running out of time. They didn't know it yet, not truly. Not in the way a drowning man knows he's slipping beneath the surface. But the signs were there, written in smoke, etched in shattered glass, whispers in prison cells, shadows in factory alleys, an empire stretched too thin, an old world creaking beneath the weight of the new. And at the heart of it all stood a man who could not bear the crown he was born to wear. Alexander III, son of a murdered Tsar. He came to power soaked in his father's blood, with the smell of gunpowder still fresh in the streets. They had blown his father apart, piece by piece, in broad daylight, and Alexander, heavy-set, grim, silent, drew only one conclusion from the carnage. Reform was weakness. Where his father had opened the door to change, Alexander slammed it shut. He believed in power, unquestioned, absolute. He turned the empire inward, crushed dissent, rolled back freedoms. The universities were silenced, the newspapers shackled, the secret police, the Okhrana, expanded like a black tide. Every voice became a threat, every book a potential weapon. He called it restoration, but there was no glory in it, only fear. He ruled with clenched fists, suspicious eyes, and a deep iron certainty. Russia must stand still, or Russia would fall. And yet, even he could not stop the storm gathering in the east. Industrialization had finally arrived, late and uneven, like a train missing half its wheels. Cities swelled with desperate bodies. Smoke clawed at the skies. Peasants abandoned fields for factories. In St. Petersburg and Moscow, soot-blackened children slept beneath machines. Wages dropped, prices rose, hunger became habitual. And into that chaos came the ideas Catherine had once kept at bay. Marx, Engels, revolution, smuggled in pamphlets, spoken in whispers, scribbled on bathroom walls and prison ceilings. The dream of a Russia where the people ruled themselves, where the Tsar was no longer the father, but the enemy. Alexander III did not live to see it. In 1894, he died suddenly. A kidney disorder, they said. His body failed the way his empire might one day. too much pressure, too little time. He was buried in the Peter and Paul fortress, beside czars who had ruled more wisely and others who had died more violently. And then came his son, Nicholas II, the last czar. You wouldn't have noticed him in a crowd. Quiet, gentle, devout. He loved his family, loved to walk in the gardens, loved the smell of lilacs in spring. But he was not made for rule. He admitted it, even as the crown was placed upon his head. I am not prepared to be czar. He never would be. From the beginning, his reign was marked by hesitation and disaster. His ministers pulled him in every direction. He clung to tradition like a drowning man to driftwood. He believed his authority came from God, that to change was to sin. But Russia no longer believed. The cracks widened. In 1905, after a disastrous war with Japan, a conflict born of arrogance and blindness, unrest spilled into the streets. On January 22nd, unarmed protesters marched to the Winter Palace. They carried icons, not weapons. They sang hymns. They wanted bread and justice, and the Tsar to hear them. Instead, he sent troops. They fired into the crowd. The snow ran red. Bloody Sunday, they called it. A massacre, a rupture. Nicholas hadn't even been in the palace when it happened. But it didn't matter. The illusion that the Tsar was the people's father shattered. What followed was a wave of revolt that shook the empire to its roots. Strikes, riots, mutinies. For the first time, the empire's bones cracked, and though Nicholas survived, just barely, it was clear something fundamental had broken. He issued the October Manifesto, promised a parliament, promised rights. But they were half measures, deceptions, and the people remembered, especially a quiet man in exile scribbling notes by candlelight in Switzerland. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. The world would come to know him as Lenin. For now, he was just one of many, radical dreamers scattered across Europe, driven underground, hunted by police, nourished by rage. But his time would come. Russia limped into the new century already bleeding. And then, in 1914, the world tore itself apart. The Great War, what began as a conflict between empires, spiraled into a vortex of death. And once again, Russia found itself staggering toward the front. Nicholas believed it was his divine duty. He wore the uniform, took command of the army himself. But he knew nothing of war. The generals lied to him. The soldiers cursed him. Supplies vanished. Boots fell apart in the snow. Ammunition ran dry. And back home, famine sank its claws into the cities. Mothers boiled leather to feed their children. Workers rioted. Strikes spread like fire through the factories. In the capital, now called Petrograd, the mood curdled into desperation, and in the palace, another shadow crept. Her name was Alexandra, the Empress, Nicholas's wife, a German-born aristocrat, like Catherine once had been, and now despised by the people. They called her cold, aloof, a foreigner, but what they truly feared was the man she trusted, Rasputin, a peasant, a mystic, a madman, some said. He had wandered into the court years earlier, stinking of sweat and prophecy. Alexandra believed he could heal her son, Alexei, the heir, who suffered from hemophilia, the royal disease, and when Rasputin prayed over the boy, the bleeding stopped. She believed it was a miracle. Others believed it was witchcraft. He whispered into her ear, named ministers, dismissed generals. His influence poisoned everything it touched. Whispers turned into rumors. The church condemned him. The court conspired against him. And finally, in 1916, a group of noblemen decided the empire would not survive another day of his presence. They lured him to a palace on a winter night, poisoned him, shot him, beat him. He did not die. Not at first. When they finally dragged his body from the river, his lungs were full of water. He had drowned, still fighting. Even in death, Rasputin haunted them. And just weeks later, the empire began to die with him. Not with explosions, not with banners, but with hunger. It began with women standing in bread lines. Then workers walked out of factories. Then soldiers joined them. And suddenly, the entire capital was in open revolt. The year was 1917. The Tsar was on a train, far from the city, still convinced that a show of force would end the unrest. By the time he returned, It was over. The Duma, the parliament he had tried to weaken for years, now refused his commands. His generals advised him to abdicate. His family was under house arrest. The dynasty was collapsing around him like ice beneath a thaw. Nicholas II, last emperor of Russia, heir to Peter, to Catherine, to 1,000 years of power, signed the document. He abdicated the throne, not to a son, not to a brother, but to no one. The Romanovs had fallen, but the story was not over. Not yet, because even in exile the Tsar still lived, and in the distance, Lenin was returning.
The Romanovs had fallen, but they were not yet dead. Outside the walls of the Alexander Palace, spring bloomed. Trees stirred with quiet wind. Somewhere, a bird sang. Inside, the windows were shuttered. Guards paced the corridors. And in a dimly lit room, Nicholas Romanov, no longer a Tsar, no longer an emperor, no longer anything at all, sat in silence. He had abdicated in March. By August, he was a prisoner. First, at Tsarskoye Selo, then Tobolsk, then Yekaterinburg, deeper and deeper into the spine of Russia, as the country unraveled around him. The provisional government, born in the ashes of the monarchy, had tried to maintain order, tried to appease the people while preserving the old bones of empire. But it was no use. They were too late, too weak, and too afraid of the tide rising beneath their feet. That tide had a name, Bolsheviks, and they were not afraid. On October 25th, 1917, by the old calendar, Lenin and his followers stormed the Winter Palace. The guards barely resisted. The ministers fled. What Catherine had once called the cradle of empire was now a nest of revolution. The Tsar was finished. Now so too was the idea of a Russia ruled by kings. Lenin declared a new order. No more nobles. No more crowns. No more God. Only the people, only the party, only the revolution. But revolutions are never clean. The Bolsheviks had seized power, yes, but not all of Russia. The empire was fracturing. The Red Army marched under the hammer and sickle, but across vast swaths of land, the White Army, monarchists, liberals, former generals, fought to take it back. A civil war was coming, and in the middle of that firestorm sat the Romanovs, Nicholas, Alexandra. Their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the young Tsarevich, Alexei. The boy whose blood could not clot. The child whose disease had drawn Rasputin like a vulture to the court. They had been shuffled from palace to palace, guarded by men who no longer saluted. Their meals grew smaller, their rooms colder. Letters were read, censored, denied. Their world shrank to a few square meters. And then, one night in July 1918, the whispers became orders. The family was told to dress. A photograph, they said. A safety precaution. The Whites were approaching Yekaterinburg. The Romanovs needed to be moved again. They were led to a basement. A single bulb hung from the ceiling. The walls were bare. Dust clung to everything. They stood in a row. Nicholas, Alexandra, the children, a few servants. They waited. And then the doors opened. 12 men entered, armed, cold-eyed. One of them read a statement. "The Ural Soviet has decided to execute you." Nicholas turned. "What?" he asked. And the bullets began. They shot him first. Chest, head, spine. Alexandra screamed. The girls huddled together. The soldiers fired again and again, but the bullets seemed not to kill them. Their corsets were lined with diamonds, sewn into their dresses for safekeeping. The gems turned the bullets, turned flesh to agony. They moaned, cried, crawled. And still the guns fired. It took 20 minutes. When it was done, the bodies were thrown into trucks, stripped, burned, buried in secret. For decades, no one would know where. The empire had ended. So too had the family. But Russia did not rest. It burned. The civil war raged across the land. White against red, brother against brother. Towns turned to ash, millions dead. Famine swept the countryside. Entire villages disappeared. Lenin ruled from Moscow now, but even he could barely contain the chaos he had unleashed. He called it necessary. He called it history. And in the shadows of this new world, something old still flickered. In the West, whispers began to spread. One of them had survived. Some said it was Anastasia, the youngest daughter, the one with the sharp eyes and clever tongue. Others claimed Alexei had been smuggled away. Impostors emerged. Thin girls with regal manners, limping boys with haunted eyes. Some believed. Others knew better. But the lie persisted, because Russia had not just killed a family, it had killed a legend. A way of seeing the world, the divine right of kings, the hand of God on the crown. And when something that's sacred dies, people want to believe some piece of it still lives, even if it doesn't, even if it never could. Lenin died in 1924, young, sick, already eaten from within by strokes and suspicion. His embalmed body was laid in a glass coffin, and beside him, a new face rose from the bloodied ground. Stalin. He was no Tsar, but the boots fit just fine. Russia had changed its name, changed its anthem, changed its future. But the past still lingered, in photographs, in broken palaces, in bones buried under forest floors. The story of the Romanovs was over. Or so it seemed, because history, like Russia, never forgets, and it never forgive.
The bones lay silent for decades, hidden beneath birch trees, swallowed by soil and secrecy, scattered across the outskirts of Yekaterinburg. No gravestone, no monument, just forest, just wind, just silence. The Soviet Union had buried more than a family. It buried the truth. Files sealed, witnesses silenced, questions left to rot. Officially, the Romanovs had been moved, then lost, then forgotten. Their execution was never publicly confirmed, not for years. The new regime needed myths more than facts, and the Romanovs, they were dangerous ghosts, symbols of a past too sacred to kill cleanly. But you can only bury so much for so long. In the darkness of exile, in Paris and London and New York, the whispers began to bloom, letters smuggled, stories told in firelit rooms. Survivors, always survivors, came forward. The most famous? A woman found in a Berlin asylum, trembling, soaked, pulled half dead from a canal. She refused to give her name, but she had scars, a Russian accent, an uncanny resemblance. Anastasia. That name, it haunted the world. She said nothing for months. And then, suddenly, she spoke. She said she was the Grand Duchess, the daughter of the last Tsar. She knew names, faces, places she should not have known. The former court split. Some believed, some recoiled. She called herself Anna Anderson. She held on to that name for 60 years. But was she the lost Romanov? Or just a lost soul? The world wanted to believe. Hollywood made movies. Books sold by the millions. After all, how could the last act of an empire be so senseless, so brutal, so final? Wasn't it easier to dream of one girl escaping, carrying the bloodline in her veins, her story waiting to be told? But myths can't hide forever. In 1979, in a shallow grave outside Yekaterinburg, two amateur historians, armed with maps, hunches, and quiet rage, uncovered something. Bones. A grave. They didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Not in Brezhnev's Russia. Not where history was still dangerous. But they marked the site. They remembered. And when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, they returned, this time with scientists, this time with permission. The grave contained 9 bodies: Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 daughters, 4 servants, burned, beaten, broken, but not whole. 2 were missing, Alexei and 1 daughter, maybe Maria, maybe Anastasia. The theories flared again. Had they escaped after all? In 2007, another grave was found near the first. It held 2 more children. Teeth, bone fragments, a boy's femur, a girl's skull. DNA testing confirmed what bloodlines never could. No one escaped that night in Yekaterinburg. Not Anastasia, not Alexei, not anyone. Anna Anderson was a Polish factory worker, mentally ill, a victim of war, of trauma, of her own mind, but not a Romanov. The fairy tale was over. And yet, the Romanovs would not stay buried, not truly. In 1998, 80 years after their deaths, the remains were finally returned to St. Petersburg. A ceremony was held in the shadow of a country that no longer existed. Russian flags fluttered beside Orthodox crosses. The coffins were laid in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, the resting place of Catherine, of Peter, of the long-dead czars who once ruled from gilded thrones. President Boris Yeltsin attended. He called it a crime, a national tragedy, but it was more than that. It was a reckoning. The Soviet experiment had collapsed. Lenin's corpse still lay in Red Square, but his empire was gone. The hammer and sickle had been lowered, the anthem rewritten. The people hungry once more, not for bread this time, but for meaning. And in that emptiness, the ghosts returned. Paintings of Nicholas and his family reappeared in churches. Icons were wept over, candles lit. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized the Romanovs as passion-bearers, saints not for how they ruled, but for how they died, meek, resigned, martyrs to history. Too. Nicholas, the man who had failed his country, was now called Tsar. Nicholas the passion-bearer. His children, innocent saints. Their bones now lie beneath polished marble, beneath golden domes. Pilgrims kneel beside them, flowers are laid at their feet. But Catherine is there too, not in body. Her tomb lies farther down the corridor, entombed in grandeur she built with her own hands, but in spirit, in silence, in contradiction. She too was German-born, she too ruled an empire not her own, but unlike Nicholas, she bent Russia to her will, made it stronger, wiser, more dangerous, and yet she too could not stop what was coming. No one could. Because history is not just kings and queens. It's not just wars and palaces. It's belief, in power, in legacy, in blood, and when that belief breaks, so does the world built upon it. The Romanovs ruled for more than 300 years, but they died like strangers in the night, forgotten, beaten, burned, and for a century Russia tried to forget. But forgetting is not the same as healing, and silence is not the same as peace. Not in Russia. Not ever.
She was never supposed to be remembered this way, not in shadows, not beneath the weight of tragedy that followed her successors. Not as a footnote in the end of a dynasty she had once reshaped with nothing more than ambition, cunning, and fire. But history does not grant control, not even to empresses. Catherine died alone in her study, on a cold morning in November 1796. The woman who had ruled Russia longer than any other since Peter the Great, the woman who transformed herself from Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst into Catherine the Great, collapsed silently beside her writing desk. No deathbed scene, no final words, just a sudden fall, a final silence. She was 76, and she had reigned for 34 years. When they found her, the servants wept. But not for a mother, or a friend. Few could claim that title. They wept because something enormous had ended, something terrifying and magnificent, a force of nature gone still. The empire she left behind was vast, bloated, uneasy. Russia was bigger than it had ever been, but cracks had formed. The wars had drained the treasury. The nobles had grown restless. The serfs still suffered. Enlightenment had flickered, then dimmed. Her reforms, so bold in youth, had faltered with age. And waiting in the wings was her son, Paul, the child she had plotted to keep from the throne. The boy she saw as soft, petulant, incapable. She had considered naming her grandson Alexander as heir instead, but time ran out. Paul ascended, and Russia trembled. Where Catherine had been shrewd, Paul was paranoid. Where she had ruled with calculated strength, he ruled with reckless decrees. He undid her policies, mocked her memory, banned her court fashions, tried, foolishly, to reverse the tide she had set in motion. He lasted 5 years. Then came assassination. Strangulation in his own palace. The empire Catherine had built devoured her own son. But her grandson? Alexander I would grow into the man Catherine had hoped for. He would fight Napoleon. He would march into Paris. And for a moment, Russia would stand as Europe's savior. Still, Catherine's presence loomed behind it all. The woman who had modernized Russia, westernized it, weaponized it. She brought philosophers to court and spies to the shadows. She rewrote laws in the language of reason, then silenced revolt with bayonets. A paradox of steel and ink. A ruler who wrote of liberty while owning millions. A lover of Voltaire who crushed rebellions without mercy. A patron of art who ruled by fear. And perhaps that's why she endures, not in spite of her contradictions, but because of them. Catherine was not kind. She was not just. She was not moral by any modern measure, but she was real. Real in her ambition, real in her intelligence, real in the sheer magnitude of her will. She broke every rule a woman of her time was meant to follow, and then rewrote the rules themselves. She seized power through bloodless coup. She outmaneuvered armies, allies, and lovers. She defied centuries of tradition and became the living embodiment of an empire too vast to tame. And in the end, she left behind something more enduring than borders or battles. She left behind the story. The girl born into minor nobility, who became empress of all the Russias. The outsider who mastered the court, who spoke perfect French in German halls and perfect Russian in palatial corridors, whose mind absorbed everything, whose hunger never faded. The woman who, when she could not inherit greatness, became it. And perhaps that is what haunts us most, because buried beneath the marble and myth is a truth we recognize, that history does not belong to the noble, or the kind, or the good. It belongs to the relentless, to those willing to gamble everything, to those who refuse to be forgotten. And Catherine, she never was. Her name still echoes through the halls of palaces she once ruled. Her eyes still stare from oil paintings, sharp, amused, calculating. Her bones lie in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, beside Peter the Great, whom she once claimed as her idol. But her legacy, it lives far beyond stone and tomb. It lives in the uneasy questions she left behind. What does it mean to rule? What must be sacrificed? And who, in the end, writes the final word? The empire is gone, the crown melted down, the palaces repurposed or left to dust. But Catherine remains, not just as a figure of power, but as a mirror. And when you look long enough, you begin to see not just her, but yourself. And that is what makes her story eternal. Subscribe Whisper from History.